So today I'm going to be talking to you about the question of women's inclusion in philosophy. Women have been excluded from participating in philosophy throughout its history, and they have also been excluded from the stories that we tell about the history of philosophy. So when you ask students, especially students who haven't taken my modules, to name some philosophers, they will almost certainly name a long list of men, unless they've taken a course on feminist philosophy or gender. But in reality, many women philosophers have existed throughout the history of philosophy. Some women were incredibly famous at the time that they were writing. They've written not only letters and correspondence, but full philosophical treatises on the nature of physics, politics, education, mind, and much else besides. Nevertheless, it seems to be the case that their contributions continue to be obscured and sidelines. So it's certainly true that there are fewer women in philosophy than men in philosophy. That's partly just a clear consequence of our kind of formal and informal exclusion from the discipline. Women weren't considered fit to think in a way that philosophers are meant to think. But even women who made this very substantive contribution in philosophy in their day remain a kind of niche interest to contemporary philosophers. So there's a kind of double exclusion going on for women in philosophy. Women first have to break through a number of formal and informal barriers in order to do philosophy and be considered successful. And then even when they have done that, they have to fight to be remembered as philosophers. In her agenda-setting paper on the history of philosophy, Eileen O'Neill laments that women in philosophy seem to be writing in disappearing ink. Nevertheless, her chapter ends with a kind of call for how philosophy might do better. She says one day we might escape being footnotes and flourishes to the history of philosophy, makers of nothing more than silk knots and little nothings. So my motivation today is to talk about women in philosophy initiatives as a kind of response to the problem of women's exclusion from philosophy. And this comes from a place of trying to make these initiatives as kind of productive as they possibly can be. So I hope it's a kind of friendly criticism. So here's what I'm going to do. I've got about 45 minutes, I think. So I'm going to start by painting a picture of what I call the sense of unease about women in philosophy initiatives as a response to the problem of formal and informal exclusion. I'm going to suggest that women in philosophy initiatives might be a kind of overcorrection in some contexts to the problem of women's exclusion. And I'm going to do that by looking at the way in which feminist historians of philosophy have conceptualized the projects that they undertake. And I'm going to look at 3 different ways that they conceptualize those projects: recovery, recognition, and what I call enduring inclusion. And then I'm going to suggest that women in philosophy initiatives, I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute, might frustrate the more substantive goal of achieving something like enduring inclusion. So, it's fair to say that over the last 20 years, we've seen a kind of boom in women in philosophy initiatives. So in this category, we might include many excellent books, essay collections, special issues, conferences, and much more. And this explosion has gone into particular philosophical subdisciplines as well as books aimed at a general audience. And the eruption of work on women philosophers can be characterized as an act of collective correction, aiming to establish, or in some cases re-establish, women as central players in philosophy. So these initiatives show not only that there were women engaged in philosophy throughout the history of our discipline, but that there are many different ways of doing philosophy well. So women, other gender minorities, and people of color in philosophy have to overcome pervasive stereotypes about what counts as doing good philosophy. And Christy Dotson says philosophy is what she calls a white man's game. So initiatives highlighting the contributions of women surely help us to overcome this exclusion. I should say up front, The Philosopher Queens is a book that I edited, so this critique is somewhat internal. It's much more fun to have a go at your own previous work than to pick somebody else to fight with, so that's what I'm doing today. But that's sort of what I mean when I say that this, I hope, is a friendly critique, given that I'm primarily kind of attacking me from 5 years ago. So the focus on women in philosophy is a very reasonable response to the well-established woman problem in philosophy. So philosophy as an academic discipline has lagged behind others in the humanities and social sciences in their hiring and publication practice. Most STEM subjects have taken faster and more efficient action to solve the problem of diversity, at least among their kind of permanent members of staff. There's two very good reports in the UK context, the Society for Women in Philosophy and the British Philosophical Association, published in 2011 and 2021, looking at how many women were employed in full-time academic posts in philosophy, and it increased by, I think, 1 or 2% in that 10-year period. So in the context of this boom, of this kind of sudden concentration on women's work, the kind of actual conditions of women in philosophy haven't really improved all that much, at least in terms of having a full-time job. Philosophy has what's been described as a leaky pipeline. So roughly 48% of women, of undergraduates in philosophy classes in the UK are women. So we have a kind of balanced cohort coming into philosophy at the undergraduate level. The problem is that women will drop off at every stage. So we have a leaky pipeline as we go through. So this is a problem for master's level study, PhDs, postdoctorate, and then professional positions, until we get to this kind of 30%, high 20s number for full-time academic posts. Women also have a lower citation rate and a publication rate than men in philosophy. So there's a very good paper published in Ethics in 2022, which shows that women are less likely to have published in top-ranking ethics journals. They kind of hypothesize why this might be the case. It might be they think that women are less likely to send papers to these journals, that the journal styles maybe aren't as accepting of the things that women happen to be focused on. But what's important to note is that insofar as we think as citing and publishing is very important for progressing in philosophy, if women are being cited and publishing less than men, then that causes kind of more problems further down the line. Women in philosophy also face well-documented sexual harassment. Jennifer Saul started a website called What's It Like to Be a Woman in Philosophy, where she collected anonymous stories from lecturers and students about their experiences of sexual harassment in philosophy. There's some kind of relatively speculative evidence that it's worse in philosophy than other academic disciplines. Some people have discussed why that might be the case. But what we want to focus on here is that, if there's a kind of pervasive culture of sexual harassment, that might make women more likely to leave the discipline, reasonably. And we shouldn't forget that it wasn't that long ago that women were formally prevented from working or studying in institutions that allow them to have a full degree in something like philosophy. So some colleges didn't admit women until the late 1980s. Some universities in France didn't admit women until the late 1980s. When I worked at Cambridge, I was at King's College, and they didn't admit women until, I think, the 50s or 60s. And I had a nice friendly relationship with a very elderly mathematician professor, and he was telling me the stories about how when they announced that women were going to be allowed to get a degree at Cambridge, the male students made a fake coffin and wrote the Cambridge degree across it and carried it through the square. And this wasn't that long ago. So it's worth remembering these kind of structural constraints that still face women in philosophy today. And what's interesting is even in the context of the kind of boom in women in philosophy initiatives that we appear to see today, not many women seem to be being included in the kind of popular contemporary books that are being published on the history of philosophy more generally. The point here isn't to kind of single anybody out as being particularly blameworthy, but to show that there's a kind of pervasive problem that even though there's lots of excellent work going on recovering and recognizing the contributions of women philosophers, they don't seem to be being included still in the story of philosophy more broadly. So A.C. Grayling's book, published I think in 2021, The History of Philosophy, has 2 pages on feminist philosophy where he talks very quickly about Martha Nussbaum in the context of her debate with Peter Singer. And that's all. There's another really good example of this from Andrew Janiek's book on Emily de Châtelet about a very popular kind of compendium of the history of philosophy that's used in America, which is about 1,200 pages long. It used to not include a single woman philosopher in the book. It was pointed out to them that this was a problem, and so they added 1 page on Elizabeth of Bohemia's correspondence with Descartes. I think there's good reasons to think that that kind of inclusion is actually much worse. It makes it look as though the only thing that a woman ever did in the history of philosophy was write somebody else a letter about what they thought. And so this kind of pseudo-inclusion is not only completely historically inaccurate, but it also does a kind of disservice to women in philosophy. So some forms of kind of thin inclusion can actually be more harmful than good. Okay. I asked an AI to generate an image of women in philosophy. And it came up with this. You'll see they don't have faces, some of them don't have legs, some of them have hands that have melted into the page. It's interesting because I do this exercise. So there's this fabulous module at Bristol that's run by Alex Tatesell. She does an exercise with her 3rd years where they put into an AI image generator different things to try and prompt it to push out a woman doing philosophy. So they say things like a philosopher wearing makeup or a philosopher wearing a dress. And what it will give you is Aristotle wearing makeup or Plato wearing a dress. So it just seems far more likely that Aristotle would kind of have contour on than that a woman would be engaged in doing philosophy. So I'm not sure that this kind of substantively tells us that much about the inclusion or exclusion of women in philosophy, but I will come back to it later on, his kind of haunting image. So I haven't told you yet which initiatives I have in mind. We might think that women in philosophy initiatives captures lots of different things. For instance, they might capture kind of organizations that have a data collecting function or a representative function, or who organize mentorship schemes or something like that. Those are not my target. My target are these initiatives that frame women's thought primarily, in brackets, through the lens of their gender. So the worry I have about these initiatives is that they organize women's thought around gender and have no other reasons for combining these women as particular figures other than the fact that they happen to be women. Perhaps women in a particular period, but it's primarily about being a woman philosopher as opposed to something else. It's important to notice that I still think that these initiatives can be very valuable, but what I want to argue is that there's at least a kind of trade-off going on here between different things that we might think of as being valuable in these contexts. I'll explain more what I mean about that in a moment. So I want to talk about a kind of general sense of unease that some people might have about women in philosophy initiatives of this kind. I'm not committed to the idea that everybody will feel this sense of unease. So, for instance, lots of people have said to me that they don't feel at all uneasy about women in philosophy initiatives, and that's completely fine. My argument doesn't rely on this kind of sense of unease. But lots of people do talk about having a kind of sense of unease about making women's womanhood too salient. I want to kind of diagnose what that might be. So one worry might be that it expresses a kind of concern about tokenism. So tokenism captures worries about being included for the wrong kinds of reasons. So when women are included tokenistically, they're not being taken seriously necessarily as thinkers, but they're included in some kind of quest for gender representation. So the problem here is about a kind of hierarchy of priorities. So imagine a familiar case of a set of conference organisers who realise their need for a woman on their all-male lineup. So to ensure that a woman is included, first they come up with a list of all the women who could be included, and then they apply their kind of usual standards for deciding who's good and who's not good. So someone who's selected in this manner might reasonably ask, if you hadn't put the first gender-based constraint in place, would I have been chosen at all? And tokenism is often a problem precisely because people are included in a kind of shallow way. So organisers often want to ensure that there's at least one woman on the lineup, but they don't want to deal with the kind of exclusion of women from philosophy in a more substantive sense. So many women in academia, not just philosophy, have stories about being asked to fill a panel spot at the last moment, or maybe being asked to chair a panel full of men, so that at least there's a woman on the stage, even if she's performing a kind of service role. And there are more systematic effects of tokenism as a kind of structural system in which non-dominant group members have to compete with each other for one spot. So the problem of tokenism is precisely that you are a token. It's not about including women or other gender minorities in a substantive way. It's about ensuring that you kind of look particularly good. Anke Gauss has a really good paper called something like 2 Cheers for Tokenism, where she talks about the positive reasons for thinking that tokenism might not be such a bad thing. But what I want to say here is that in the kind of women in philosophy initiatives that I'm discussing, concerns about tokenism are less worrisome. The close possible world in which one's gender identity is not part of the shortlisting process doesn't really exist in the case of an event or a book or a collection entirely framed around women in philosophy. So everyone is being included or excluded in this gender-constrained way. The whole point is to include women because they're women. So I don't think that concerns about tokenism explain the sense of unease here. Ella Whiteley has recently published a really fabulous paper in Ethics about salience and attention. And what they argue is that framing someone in this way involves a kind of relative attentional surplus to the wrong property. That's a kind of technical way of saying you're spending too much time focusing on the wrong thing. So in very simple terms, when someone is introduced as a black artist as opposed to merely an artist, the grounds for complaint involve a misplacing of salience. Too much attention is given to the artist's blackness and not enough to their status as an artist. So when we describe someone as a woman philosopher, the woman here is acting as a kind of qualifier. We focus too much on the woman's womanhood as opposed to her status as a philosopher. Of course, women in philosophy initiatives often highlight the gender of the thinkers in question precisely to increase overall attention. So this is something that I'll come back to in a moment. And attention deficits and surpluses therefore might pull in different directions. So in such cases, we might highlight the gender of women in philosophy as women in order to pay more attention to them, or try to get other people to pay more attention to them. And while some increase in this attention might be necessary, we might then obscure the very thing that we wish to actually highlight, the fact of their philosophy. So as Lisa Whiting and I highlighted in some of our later work on women in philosophy, we might forget that they are principally philosophers. Instead, many are immediately associated with their gender rather than the object of her study or attention. So the lens of gender can kind of give attention, but it can also take attention away. And this is troublesome in part because we highlight the gender of women in philosophy despite the fact that men have genders too. So Whiteley writes, I remember feeling the irony of joining a women in philosophy group during my doctorate while wanting not to be seen as a woman in philosophy. Colleagues who were men weren't men in philosophy, they were philosophers. I wanted to be a philosopher too. And what Whiteley highlights in the argument about salience is precisely what I think this sense of unease that some people feel about women in philosophy is. But what I want to suggest is, even if you don't think of this misplacing of salience as disrespectful or an affront to individual personhood, there are strategic reasons to be worried about the place of women in philosophy initiatives in our search for something like more substantive forms of inclusion. So I've already hinted that women in philosophy initiatives might be counterproductive to what I call the project of enduring inclusion. But what exactly is this project and how should we understand it? Of course, a very serious problem for any characterization of the women in philosophy movement is that there is no such organized movement, at least in not a kind of systematic way. Some organizations represent a kind of level of coordination like the Society for Women in Philosophy, but much of the excellent work attempting to highlight women in philosophy is done in a kind of disorganized and atomistic way by individuals working kind of against the tides in particular contexts. What this means is that there's no kind of single way of conceptualizing the goals of this movement. So what I want to suggest here is that there are three different aims, at least, in the strategies of thinking about women in philosophy initiatives, and therefore our different aims and strategies might frustrate one another. So more specifically, if we seek what I call enduring inclusion, we may need to abandon some strategies that are implicitly aimed at other goods. So here I'm going to characterize three goals that I think are often implicit in feminist history of philosophy and sometimes very explicit: recovery, recognition, and enduring inclusion. So many women in philosophy initiatives might be described as having a kind of simple aim. They aim to establish the facts. They show that women have engaged in philosophy throughout the history of the discipline, and in doing so, those working on such projects recover the voices of women from the past. So they might ask very many important foundational questions. Who were these women? What were their contexts? What were their texts? And perhaps why were they excluded? This recovery effort recognizes that women philosophers have existed and that our primary task is to find them. And such a project underlines that women's exclusion from portrayals of the history of philosophy is not a result of women's actual absence. So as Linda Kerber puts it, when women are absent from the narrative history of ideas, it's not because they are truly absent, but because the historian did not seek energetically enough to find them. So such recovery efforts often seek to introduce us, or in some cases reintroduce us, to women thinkers throughout a particular period, or perhaps within a particular subdiscipline. So the Routledge Handbook for Women in Early Modern European Philosophy begins with the following claim. This handbook participates in a broad-based project of expanding our philosophical past by recovering the works of hitherto neglected philosophers. This recovery project, as they title it, has been ongoing for many decades. It's conceptualized as a first necessary step for the inclusion of women in the history of philosophy. So in the introduction to Women's International Thought, A New History, the editors say they want to do more than add women to the existing record of international thought. but their omission makes it necessary in the first instance to bring together existing forays, even as we ultimately seek to unsettle conventional assumptions. So even if you have a kind of more radical aim to sort of disrupt the very histories of international thought or philosophy, you have to start with something like recovery. The second goal that's often implicit and sometimes explicit in feminist accounts of the history of philosophy is something like recognition. So Charlotte Witt argues that feminist historians of philosophy are engaged in a recognition project. The act of recognition of the unique character of feminist work in the history of philosophy, she says, is both an intellectual act of seeing what had not been previously visible and a normative act of recognizing that the visibility is unjust. So recognition, therefore, requires not only accounting for the work of women, making sure that they're translated, making sure that they're available, but also a kind of project of repair which offers the granting of validity or worth to something that has been acknowledged to exist. So Witt argues that this background project is what unites feminist approaches to the history of philosophy in particular. It's not just the mere existence of women's work, but an ascription of worth. This emphasis on recognition makes explicit the kind of normative commitments that often underlie recovery. So you wouldn't bother recovering someone's work unless you thought it was valuable or meaningful to some extent. So both programs of recovery and recognition take place in the context of exclusion, where women have been written out of the dominant narratives of philosophy. What I think is interesting about the recognition project is there does remain some ambiguity as to who or what the key target of our recognition is. Are we aiming to recognize the philosophers themselves or their contributions? Either could be subject to claims of recognition, and of course they're very difficult to pull apart. If you don't think that the thinker is valuable, you might be unlikely to think that her work is valuable. So that's the second potential goal of Women in Philosophy initiatives. Our third, and I've said perhaps ultimate, which makes it sound slightly grander than maybe it should, goal is to secure our place in philosophy as a discipline. So while recognition seems to go beyond recovery, it's not the most substantive goal that's articulated by women engaged in these projects. So Eileen O'Neill's agenda-setting chapter asks why women appear to have been writing in disappearing ink. Why is it that women's work seems to be forgotten, obscured? And more importantly, as Lisa Shapiro puts it, how do we rework the narrative of philosophy so as not only to include the writings of these women, but to ensure that their inclusion endures? So we've already noted these first two goals of Women in Philosophy initiatives, and both projects seem necessary to any quest for enduring inclusion. We must, at the very basic level, know about the lives and thoughts of these women that we're hoping to include. But the project isn't over when some women are known or maybe even respected. Instead, we want to make sure that women's inclusion is robust in some way. And I think we can even claim that some women throughout the history of philosophy have been recovered and perhaps even recognized as key players in the field. So a question remains as to how to ensure that this kind of inclusion is long-lasting, concrete, substantive in a particular way. This is important because despite the efforts of women working on these kinds of questions, these projects often ebb and flow in their longevity. I remember when doing some book event for the Philosopher Queens, I was told about a pamphlet from the 16th century which gathered together particular instances of women in philosophy. So we've had kind of women in philosophy initiatives for a very long time, but they don't seem to be sticking in the way that we might want them to. So this continued lack of something like enduring inclusion isn't because of a lack of women, contemporary women, making noise about historic exclusion. Instead, it might be to do with something like thin forms of pseudo-inclusion, where people think the inclusion of one woman is sufficient to plug the historical gap, or a small number of feminists come to represent all of women in the history of philosophy. So claims to enduring inclusion don't seem to function necessarily as claims to something like strict equality. Instead, the demand is that women are secure in their status as philosophers. And this security requires a certain amount of strategic thinking about how to secure women's status in the discipline. Feminist historians of philosophy have been very self-reflective about the various strategies that we might adopt for something like enduring inclusion. So first, we might try something like assimilation, tying women's contributions to the dominant ways of thinking about philosophy. But as Lisa Shapiro argues, it's tempting to solve the problem of women's omission from the history of philosophy by sticking to the story that we've been telling the whole time and just kind of adding women to that story. But there are several obvious problems with this approach. First, it means placing women as second best to the kind of real philosophers that were there the whole time. And second, it also means that where there are issues that women have historically engaged in, such as women's education, these topics remain sidelined. So assimilation as a strategy might be effective because it requires kind of less of other people, but it also doesn't leave us space to kind of critically reevaluate the terms of exclusion. A second, more substantive approach might be to radically rethink the way that we approach teaching about the history of philosophy. So this could include expanding our ways of thinking about philosophical methodology or shifting the core questions that occupy the philosophical canon. The problem with this approach, insofar as it is a problem, requires far more substantive overhaul of the way that we approach philosophy. And this way may well be a good thing, but it requires buy-in from those who aren't engaged in recovery and recognition projects. So it's not my intention to work through the kinds of pros and cons of each of these different approaches. But what we should note is that the goal of both of these approaches, even though they're very different, is that women's inclusion is cemented to some extent. So the first section of this paper outlined the sense of unease generated by women in philosophy initiatives, and I said that not everybody's going to feel this sense of unease. But some seem to think that there's something unsettling about framing women's contributions through the lens of their gender. And while Ella Whiteley has pointed out the individual harms that might come from this misplacing of salience, I hinted that there might be broader harms, most notably to the project of women's inclusion itself. So more specifically, framing these women philosophers as women philosophers might frustrate our goals of securing enduring inclusion because they emphasize the very feature that we should seek to make less salient. And this is not to say that these kinds of initiatives never serve a purpose, but as we progress through the different stages of our goals, from recovery to recognition to inclusion, it may be that these initiatives become counterproductive. Some people might not see themselves as committed to the project of enduring inclusion, but those of us who do wish for more substantive forms of inclusion, women in philosophy initiatives might pose a particularly strategic challenge. So one way to think more about these projects is to look at how authors and editors choose to frame them in certain ways. So I've read more introductions to these books than I can remember. And there are two kind of very interesting things that fall out of these introductions. First, most initiatives of this kind explicitly reject gender essentialism. They're not committed to the idea that women have some kind of shared essence that informs their philosophy, so there isn't a kind of womanly way of doing philosophy. This seems obvious, perhaps, given the kind of vast methodological differences between women, not to mention direct disagreement between women philosophers. And Mary Warnock's introduction to her anthology, Women Philosophers, notes that she found no clear shared voice among them. And most contemporary books and collections go even further than this. They instead are committed to an explicit form of anti-essentialism that involves deconstructing the very idea of gender itself. So, for instance, in the introduction to Women in the History of International Thought, the authors say that they adopt the category historical women to indicate the discursive and produced character of our object of study. Philosophy for Girls, a collection of essays by women philosophers on various topics, also explicitly rejects gender essentialism. So not only are these projects not committed to the idea that there's a womanly way of doing philosophy, but they seek to kind of destabilize the category of gender, even as they use it in their titles. It's also not the case that women in such collections share a kind of feminist methodology or disposition. So Gertrude Boll has recently argued against these feminist framings of women in the history of philosophy as they generate their own forms of exclusion. So sometimes a feminist emphasis in the way that we interpret women through the history of philosophy tends to foreground more palatable aspects of their work and hides potentially less attractive aspects of what they've said. So, for instance, Boll argues that Mary Estelle's legacy as primarily a feminist figure hides other aspects of her thinking, particularly her conservatism. In the case of Catherine Macaulay, there's good evidence that her contemporary readers didn't pay very much attention to her work on women's education, but that's primarily the way in which she's portrayed today. And perhaps even more problematically, a kind of feminist emphasis means that women philosophers are subject to a double standard. So where men are included in the history of philosophy despite being sexist or misogynistic, women's inclusion requires them to have championed doctrines or arguments agreeable to modern audiences. So the collections that I have in mind don't necessarily share a commitment to feminism. Indeed, some explicitly reject a feminist framework, and many of these collections include anti-feminist thinkers. Some kind of obviously share a feminist disposition or ethos, but in other words, the project seems to be motivated by something like feminist reasons, but the primary criteria for women being included in anthologies or essay collections is not their feminism, but their womanhood. The principal reason for grouping women together in such initiatives seems to be the fact of historical exclusion itself. Most essay collections and anthologies begin with an account of women's exclusion from the history of philosophy. But there's a question of how such exclusion can be used for the project of inclusion, especially when we adopt a kind of anti-essentialism about a womanly way of doing philosophy. One way might be to adopt the language of something called strategic essentialism, using the categories created by exclusion to demand inclusion. Strategic essentialism as a framework is most commonly articulated in queer theory and post-colonial feminism as a way of thinking about difference and conflict. So strategic essentialism is a way of positioning yourself as part of a particular identity category, making that category particularly salient in order to demand inclusion. And in a sense, this potentially obscuring differences between group members in order to make a stronger claim for inclusion. So this concept of strategic essentialism is lifted from 2 interviews from Spivak, in which she seems to endorse kind of adopting categories that could essentialize in order to achieve certain kinds of political goals. The relevant category in her case is something like third world women, where the category is used even when the people using the category accept that it is a bad one. And what we have to do when engaging in something like strategic essentialism is constantly remind ourselves of this thing that we're up to, kind of using the category while mocking it to some extent, using it as a kind of marketing mechanism while nevertheless thinking that the category ultimately needs to be disposed of. In the case of many women in philosophy initiatives, many of the people involved in them are trying to achieve something by framing women in philosophy as women in philosophy. They're using the category of gender not just to organize the women's thought in a particular way, but to portray them in a particular way to an audience. And we might do that while wishing to get away from the category of something like women in philosophy altogether. The problem with strategic essentialism is that at some point you have to dispose of the category that you're using strategically. And I think that the lens of recovery, recognition, and enduring inclusion can give us a kind of framework to understand when we should dispose of the categories. And importantly, lots of people have noted, specifically in the kind of 1990s discussion of identity politics, that this form of strategic essentialism, or using categories in order to make political claims, can be counterproductive. But the point that's most saliently put by Wendy Brown in her very good paper, Wounded Attachments, is that at some point you have to get rid of the category that you're using. So she says this past of exclusion cannot be redeemed unless the identity ceases to be invested in, and it cannot cease to be invested in without giving up its identity as such, thus giving up its economy or avenging at the same time as perpetuating its hurt. So in a later interview, Spivak came to exactly the same conclusion, that even using identity in a strategic way is untenable because it centers the category that we should be seeking to make less salient. We might just think that this is a kind of general, basic problem faced by marginalized groups, that their exclusion shapes the terms of their capacity to demand inclusion. So Joan Willock-Scott, in Only Paradoxes on Offer, speaks about the kinds of ways in which women have to both affirm and contest their identity in order to make legible claims. She says feminism was a protest against women's political exclusion. The goal was to eliminate sexual difference in politics, but it had to make the claims on behalf of women who were discursively produced through sexual difference. To the extent that it acted for women, feminism produced the sexual difference that it sought to eliminate. So it might be that this is just a kind of intractable, tragic problem of historic exclusion, that in framing women's contribution as based on their historic exclusion from the discipline, we therefore forestall their capacity to claim inclusion on other grounds. They always have to ask to be included as women philosophers as opposed to philosophers. So what's the proposal? So my proposal is that we should cease to engage in women in philosophy initiatives at some point, and I'll come back to that in a moment. And to do so is the only way to escape the trap of being unable to move from something like recovery and recognition to some substantive and more robust way of thinking about women's inclusion in the discipline. So when? So when should we seek to move away from women in philosophy initiatives? Should I have published my book 5 years ago? So my argument is basically that there is a certain point at which these projects do more harm than good. I'm not necessarily too interested in litigating whether we are in fact at that moment, whether these projects are already ceasing to do the good that we think they might do. So, and I don't want to argue that we're necessarily there in every instance, so indeed the evaluation might shift depending on which groups and which individuals we're talking about. So early modern philosophy has been particularly good at recovering and recognizing particular women thinkers. 19th century philosophy has been much worse. There's a new anthology being published, I think, this month on 19th century women philosophers. That kind of framing might still be justified in the context of a kind of that recovery and recognition hasn't finished just yet. And other groups within the category of women in philosophy might still be strategically justified in using this approach. So work by black women in philosophy is far less well recognized than work by affluent white European women, and such projects that highlight black women in philosophy might be justified in marketing these projects in particular ways in order to increase initial forms of attention. But my view is that at least if we continue on in a kind of trajectory towards something like enduring inclusion, which is very much up for grabs at the moment, all projects will eventually face this challenge, the question of when to dispose of the categories that you seek to make less salient. Thank you very much.